So yesterday we left off talking about Robert the Bruce and his fight against the English in Scotland. And the reason that that is significant and why it has relevance to what we're talking about in Ireland is that under Edward the First, Edward he was fighting against the Scots, he was fighting against the Welsh, but he also had, his English lords in Ireland as well. And one thing that the Scots realized that if they could distract the English by opening up another front of war for him, that might ease things for them in Scotland. And so Ireland was always something that they had in the back of their mind. And this is especially significant after the victory at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, because that battle ensured the freedom of Scotland from English interference for several centuries. But in the years leading up to this battle, Robert the Bruce had actually been living in hiding. And he had lost numerous skirmishes with English forces, and he had seen his wife and his family members taken as hostages by the English soldiers. And actually, from 1306 to 1307, he was staying in hiding in Ireland on Rathlin Island, one of those islands that was first invaded by the Vikings back in 793, I think. But while he was staying on this island, just outside of Ireland, he wrote a letter to the Irish, and it was titled, it was sent to all the kings of Ireland, to the prelates and clergy, and to the inhabitants of all Ireland, our friends. And he's asking them essentially for their help in his fight against the English in Scotland. He stated in the letter, quote, "We and you, our people and your people, have been free since ancient times, stem from one seed of birth, and are urged to come together in love, more eagerly and joyfully by a common language and by common custom." He then added that he was sending over his beloved kinsmen, which were two of his brothers, to negotiate with the Irish about, quote, "permanently strengthening and maintaining inviolate the special relationship between us and you, so that with God's will our nation may be able to recover her ancient liberty," unquote. Robert was essentially sending out an appeal to the Irish lords, hoping that they would help him in his fight against the English in Scotland, because they had these shared roots. And it's this idea that, Ireland helped colonize parts of Scotland. Remember, with all of the Christian monks that went over and founded monasteries and spread Christianity there. There's a lot of that shared culture and language, and the Gaelic language in Ireland is the same that's spoken in the Highlands in Scotland. So Robert the Bruce saw this connection and was hoping to sort of capitalize on it. And in fact, he was able to. There was a number of Irish bands that were fighting with Robert the Bruce at the Battle of Bannockburn. But so after this successful battle at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, the Irish saw that the Scots were able to defeat this English foe and throw them out of their lands. And it really inspired the Gaelic Irish to do the same in Ireland. And in 1315, Edward the Bruce, so the brother of Robert the Bruce, the now King of Scotland, was supposedly invited to Ireland by the King of Ulster, a Donald O'Neill, in the hope that he, Edward the Bruce, and his Scottish troops would be able to help the Irish drive the English invaders out of Ireland, as Robert the Bruce had done in Scotland earlier. So again, capitalizing on that Gaelic alliance that Robert had initiated with his letter. And in fact, Edward the Bruce takes them up on this. And it could be for a number of reasons. Edward the Bruce was known to have ambitions towards the crown. He was currently the only heir to his brother, because their other brothers had died in the battles between 1306 and 1314. But it was also this idea that even though the Scots had defeated the English in 1314, creating another war front for the English would be another way of making sure that Scotland wasn't a target on their radar anymore. But also the fact that Ireland had been used as England's breadbasket for a number of these wars. They took lots of resources from the land. They took men. I said yesterday how Edward I was having castles built in Ireland and shipped into Wales. So this idea that disrupting the production of Ireland would be another way of weakening the English. And so there was a number of reasons for Edward the Bruce to be getting involved, and not just one particular one. But Edward took up the English invitation, and he landed in Larne, which is in the eastern side of Ulster, just north of present-day Belfast. He landed in May 1315 with a large army of 6,000 Scots. And upon landing, he was able to defeat a group of local English gentry soldiers right away upon landing. So they were already showing their worth. From that point, he marched to Carrickfergus, which was one of those castles our Anglo-Normans had built right away when they invaded. He got to Carrickfergus and he offered the English garrison terms to surrender. They refused, but they did say that they would surrender in a year if they weren't relieved of this siege. So it was kind of like a temporary truce a little bit. But as his troops were there, as the Scots are here outside of Carrickfergus, Donald O'Neill, who had invited Edward the Bruce, joined his army with Edward the Bruce's army, and they were able to defeat a number of these English lords in Ulster. And actually, my student is here, so just give me one quick second, okay? Yeah, I'll Thank you. Sorry about that, guys. Duty calls. So as I was saying, the O'Neill Irish army also joined up with this Scottish army. So we've got both of the Gallic alliances now together. And together they rapidly started defeating the English lords in Ulster. And on June 6, 1315, Edward the Bruce had himself crowned King of England, or King of Ireland, excuse me. He was ambitious, as I said before, and one of the things that this supposed letter he had received inviting him to come to Ireland was that they would offer him the crown of Ireland. And he decided, with only having been in the country for about a month, that he was going to crown himself King of Ireland, a little presumptuously, I would have to say, since he has not taken all of Ireland. But this was something that he did at that time. And he was able to bring his troops, combined with the O'Neill Irish troops, in a battle against Robert de Burgh. Remember, he was our Lord of Connaught, who has kind of been moving in and disrupting a lot of our Irish lords in the Connaught area. So he met the forces of Robert de Burgh and the current justiciar of Ireland, who was a butler. He met them in battle and defeated them on September 10th, 1315. And this was quite a large defeat. I mean, they had brought a number of troops together against him. And after he was victorious over this united group of Anglo-Norman lords, he retreated back into Ulster to sort of regroup and kind of prepare for the next war season, essentially. He ended up doing about 4 different campaigns within Ireland, and so this was the end of his first campaign. But even though he was very successful at the beginning of his landing, a lot of normal, everyday Irish people were not as pleased to have him and his Scottish army in Ireland as some of their native lords may have been. And this is partly because he's marching his 6,000 Scottish troops through their pasture land, through their fields, damaging their property. And this is an even bigger deal because in 1314, we start to see kind of a weather switch, which I'm going to talk about after this section of it. We'll go into more detail, but food was scarce and it was already really important. And his troops marching through these fields and burning what they didn't take was making life even harder for the Irish. So although the Scots were there to help the Irish, they were actually making things a lot worse for some of those local Irish who were near where the Scots were settled and camped. The native Irish lords at times even allied against the Scots with the Anglo-Normans against kind of these pretenses of this new king of Ireland. So there was not a ton of cohesion across the island in regards to how they felt about this Scottish invasion. So the second campaign that Edward the Bruce does starts in December of 1315. He leaves Carrickfergus on his second campaign and marches south to Dundalk. Actually, I forgot to switch the slide. I apologize. He's at Carrickfergus up here at the top of Ulster, and he marches down here to Dundalk, where he has another battle against Roger Mortimer, who is the current Lord of Trim. And then after that, he makes his way through Meath and the leading English magnates of Leinster. So remember, after William the Marshal's death and the death of his sons, Leinster was essentially divvied up amongst a number of his female descendants. And so there isn't a cohesive ruler in that area. So the leading rulers in Leinster kind of come out to oppose these Scottish forces, and they meet him in battle on January 26, 1316. And again, the English suffer another resounding defeat. So Edward the Bruce is being very successful with these early campaigns. The Gaelic Irish that are left in Leinster were very inspired by the defeat of these Anglo-Normans by the Scottish army, and they actually start rising up and fighting themselves. So they destroy a number of different territories in Ulster. They devastate the county of Carlow, and they kind of even move into the English lordships of Desmond, and they're joined by the O'Connors and the O'Kennedys, who kind of rise up in support of these Scottish invaders. But after the sort of these victories in Leinster, we see Edward the Bruce retreating back up to Carrickfergus, where he was settled. And he starts to launch his third campaign in January of 1317. And this is normally an odd time to perform war during the winter time. But his brother, Robert the Bruce, the King of Scotland, had decided to join him at that time because the winter is an unlikely time for the English to fight. So he felt he could leave his territories in Scotland and help with the fight in Ireland. So they're doing a winter campaign, which is not always it's not an easy time to campaign for war. So they march from Carrickfergus. They decide that they were going to head towards Dublin, but upon getting closer, they realize that Dublin has put up quite a few defenses, and they're not really willing to engage in a long-term siege. Again, it's the winter, they don't have a lot of supplies. So they move past Dublin, and they decide to head towards Limerick because they had been invited by the O'Brien family to sort of root out those Anglo-Normans that had taken their territories. But the Bruces fail to capture Limerick, and in fact, they're informed that they are sort of being trailed by a number of different English armies. So they've got about 3 different lords that are kind of closing in on their position. So they kind of turn and they face the closest and smallest of them, which is being led by this justiciar of Ireland, who is a Burke. And in this battle, a number of the Scots end up dying. They do defeat the English in this battle, but not definitively. And in fact, the march from southern Munster back up to Carrickfergus is a really devastating one for them. A lot of the soldiers are starting to perish from hunger, from exhaustion, from exposure. It's cold and it's wet, and they're marching through not necessarily the best of lands. And so it was kind of a sad end to this third campaign. And when they get back up to Carrickfergus, Robert the Bruce departs and heads back to Scotland and leaves his brother Edward in control of the area of Ulster that they're in. And as I said, the local Irish people were not necessarily very happy about these Scottish invaders because, again, they were kind of trampling through their fields and making life more difficult. But as these campaigns continued and Edward the Bruce wasn't necessarily making as much headway as they had hoped he would, the Irish decided to try another means of rooting out the English from their lands. And in 1317, many Irish chieftains get together and they sign a letter that they send to Pope John the 22nd. And this is the letter from the Irish chieftains, a remonstrance of the English kings. This is one of the primary sources that I gave you in the Dropbox. And in this letter, they essentially detail the, quote, cruel wrongs that have been wrought inhumanely on them and their forefathers by kings of England, their evil ministers, and English barons born in Ireland, unquote. They claim that they had been driven by force from the spacious places where they dwelt and from the inheritance of their fathers. The English kings have compelled us to seek mountains, woods, bogs, barren tracts, and even caverns in the rocks to save our lives. And for a long time back, to make our dwellings there like beasts. And so they send this letter essentially complaining to the Pope that the papal bull, Laudabilior, that Pope Adrian had offered up to Henry II, that Henry II's descendants, these kings that came after him, have essentially not really followed the letter of that papal bull, and they were hoping that this new pope would revoke that papal bull and kind of kick the English out. In fact, what the Pope does is he just essentially forwards the letter back to the English king, Edward II at the time, and nothing comes of it. So they still have to kind of rely on Edward the Bruce, who's still in Ireland. And so for his final and fourth campaign, he kind of moves out of Carrickfergus around October of 1315. And he encounters an English force on his way to Dundalk. So he encounters them kind of right in this area here, just south of Dundalk. And it's in this battle against these English lords that had kind of risen up together to fight back against Robert the Bruce, that Robert the Bruce and his army are defeated, and Robert is killed. His corpse is quartered, and the different quarters are distributed to the four corners of England. The Carrickfergus castle that he had eventually captured was retaken by the English not long after this battle. And the Scottish power that had been established in Ulster by Edward the Bruce was at an end for the time being. And so the Scottish hopes for their alliance with the Gaelic Irish were sort of dashed with this battle. And although the Scots were gone and Edward the Bruce and his pretensions to the kingship of Ireland was gone, he did weaken the English, and the Irish were now able to sort of go about defeating the English in ways that they hadn't before. The Scots had really helped to weaken the power of the English in Ireland. Ulster had almost been completely cleared of the English by the Scots, and so those native Irish were able to kind of come in and retake their territory without putting up too much of a fight against the English inhabitants. Connaught and Munster were able to kind of return a lot of their areas to the native Irish who had once ruled there. So the O'Connors kind of came back, the O'Briens came back. And following that Norman example, what the Irish started doing is they started building their own castles. And that's where we see a lot of those Irish tower houses being built that I talked about in one of my previous lectures. So the Scottish invasion of Ireland might not have been successful for the Scots, but it was successful for the Irish in a way. And part of the reason that happened is all of northern Europe at this same time was kind of going through a devastating famine and climate shift. I had mentioned earlier that the Scottish invasion of Ireland happened during this time of widespread famine. And this was a time of shifting weather patterns. It had started across Northern Europe in around 1314, and it lasted into the 1320s. This weather shift has been known as the mini ice age, or the after effects of it have been referred to as the Great Famine. But whatever it was, there was obviously a climatic shift that happened at this time, and it caused a terrible lack of harvests. It caused famine, disease, and death in a lot of cases. This was an end of that medieval warm period. Remember, I had talked about one of the reasons why the Vikings were able to sail further up rivers and go further afield was because the water was higher because of this medieval warm period. This was sort of a reversal of that time period, and we see temperatures drop and kind of chaotic weather shifts happening at this time. Not only was Ireland the victim of these unpredictable weather patterns that prevented crops from ripening in the fields, it caused terrible rains. It stopped peasants from being able to harvest what had been able to ripen. But those armies of the Scots, of the Irish, and of the English were marching through those fields, and they were destroying what was able to grow. So it was just compounded issues. The price of grain was at an all-time high due to the scarcity of available products. There had been a lot of death amongst livestock. There was a cattle murrain, a disease that people couldn't understand that had afflicted a lot of the Irish cattle herds. So the Irish were just sort of left cold and starving during this time period. And there was really no social safety network to help them. The English government wasn't equipped to handle this crisis, nor were the Irish lords equipped to help. And so we just see a lot of families tightening their belts and trying to get through this time period. And it wasn't very easy, especially when unpredictable weather is attributed to, the wrath of God at this time. So there was a lot of concern over, what this was saying about people's relationship with God, and a lot of backlash against the church was occurring at this time period as well. And some of the after effects that we see from the mini ice age were pretty manifest, and these are kind of across the board in Northern Europe. We see that the growing season was shortened by an average of 4 weeks. That's a huge difference when it comes to harvesting. The seasons and climate was far less predictable, and it was subject to extremes for like the next 2 decades or so. And land that had previously been drained and cleared for farming space during those better years of those medieval warm period, a lot of those areas were left to kind of go back to nature, and we see less fields being harvested at this point, just because the weather is just not conducive to that extra harvestation. So kind of post this Gallic alliance time period, the English king effectively ruled the areas that he ruled over Ireland were really drastically reduced after this Scottish invasion. And in an effort to reassert and strengthen English control, the king created 3 new Anglo-Irish earldoms. He created the earldom of Kildare, and that was given to the head of the Leinster Fitzgerald, so that Maurice Fitzgerald I had spoken of previously. The earldom of Desmond was created, and this was given to the Munster Fitzgerald, so a lesser branch of that family. And the earldom of Ormond was confirmed as well, and this was given to the head of the Butler family, and they had lands around Tipperary. So these earls, along with Richard de Burgo, the Lord of Connaught, attempted to maintain an English presence in Ireland, while many other English lords fled Ireland and became absentee landlords to their Irish holdings and tenants. And during the remainder of the 14th century, of the 13th century, no, 14th century, sorry. During the remainder of the 14th century, there was a remarkable revival of Irish political power, but also of Irish culture and language, civilization, and law. We sort of see kind of a revival of this that happens across the country. The native Irish recovered large parts of Ulster, as I said before, lands in the Midlands, in Connaught, and in Leinster, while those old English families, those Anglo-Norman families that had come over with Henry II's invasion, they start becoming increasingly more Irish. Again, I've talked about this before, but the intermarriage of these families really creates kind of these connections. And we see those families adopting a lot of these Gaelic customs as well. And this was kind of known as Gaelicization. And they start using the Gaelic language. And again, this is probably because those Irish mothers, they're teaching their children Gaelic. They're teaching them Irish customs and folklore. We see a lot of our Old English wearing Irish dress and performing and getting involved in Irish customs. And oftentimes, some of these old Anglo-Norman, these old English families were often called more Irish than the Irish by newer English arrivals in Ireland. They were having a hard time telling the difference between the native Irish and those older Anglo-Norman families that had moved in with the invasion. And this difference between the older English and the newer English is really starting to become pretty stark. So and the differences between the Old English and the Irish, those differences are becoming less and less easy to discern from the outside. And this is something that starts to really concern those newer English people who are moving into Ireland, and they're inheriting lands from a distant relative or something like that. And a lot of those new English just move into the area that is surrounding Dublin, kind of the Louth area in Kildare. And that area starts to become known as the Pale, and it's still known as the Pale today. So if you look at the map, you can kind of see this red area of the Pale. Those are kind of the lands where we see a lot of our new English moving into, because it's a lot safer. There's more English control and the more of a military force there than in the countrysides. And so that area is becoming known as the Pale. English rule and law are becoming harder and harder to enforce in those lands that are held by the older English families that are outside of the Pale. Some of the new English within the Pale were actually even forced to pay Irish clans a form of protection money that started to become known as black rents. Essentially, the Irish are starting to kind of blackmail the new English that are living in the Pale, saying, if you pay us this money, we won't invade your lands, or maybe there won't be a fire in your farm or in your barn. And so the Irish are actually starting to be able to assert a little bit more authority and control over those newer English. So we're kind of seeing a switch in control within Ireland. So the 20 years or so after the end of this Gaelic alliance, this invasion of the Scots, the Old English are starting to feel as if, and it's not surprising, they're starting to feel as if they're not being welcomed within those government positions within Dublin. Again, that separation between the new English and these old English families. They don't feel like they're having a say in the ruling of Ireland anymore, that they're not welcomed into those government positions in Dublin. And this leads a lot of the Old English to delve sort of further into those politics of the native Irish and just sort of becoming even more Gaelicized. And this is really kind of to the horror of those new English that are living within the Pale. And now this situation continues unchecked for a number of years because the English kings just have other things to deal with besides dealing with their old English families going native in Ireland. Edward II had just a lot of disarray to deal with Scotland, but also a lot of the power politics that were happening at his court as well. And actually, in 1327, Edward II is forced to abdicate his throne to his 14-year-old son, Edward III, because they had sort of brought him under duress. And actually, Edward II ends up dying in some sort of tower house after his son takes his throne. It's kind of a pitiful end to a kind of a pitiful king. I'm not pitying him by any means. But there's other things that are going on. And so the English crown just isn't as interested in what is happening in Ireland at this time. And that's why we see the Irish taking back more lands and those old Anglo-Norman English families becoming more Irishized, more Gaelicized. We do see a switch, though, as Edward III ages. So in 1331, he issues an ordinance directed to his lords in Ireland, asserting that the authority of English law should be upheld by the English citizens, by the English subjects in Ireland. He wanted to make sure that the Irish government in Dublin was more efficient and that it could be a little less corrupt. He also reiterated the law that declared that any lords holding lands in Ireland had to provide for the defense of those lands. they couldn't just leech all of the profits out without putting anything back into the estates. So he is sort of reacting to the complaints that some of the old English families in Ireland have, saying that these absentee landlords are misusing their lands and they're kind of allowing those native Irish to retake them because they're not there to assert their authority. So Edward II is, or Edward III is sort of reacting to that. These complaints of mismanagement that are coming out of these old English families. However, in kind of a change of tactic, about 10 years later in 1341, when he is fully an adult and he's no longer in his minority as king, he declares that he was going to revoke all royal grants of land that the crown had given out to these old English families. And that's actually really scary. I mean, the authority that these old English lords have over their lands in Ireland come directly from these royal grants from the king. And if those are revoked, there's nothing to say that they have any control over those lands to stop those native Irish from coming and taking them. So in response to this declaration, our Old English organize and they call a parliament together amongst themselves at Kilkenny in 1341. And they put together a series of complaints and petitions about how the king had been appointing ministers to govern in positions in the government and in estates in Ireland that had no knowledge of the people or of their laws or of their customs. They claimed that these ministers were doing great harm to the people and to the government through corrupt practices of extortion and of bribery. That these English officials were actually doing more damage than the Gaelic Irish lords were doing. So very similar to that remonstrance that our Irish lords sent to the Pope back in 1317. And conveniently enough, these old English lords don't have to worry too much about having their titles revoked. Because in 1341, just after kind of announcing that he was going to do this, Edward III had essentially launched his bid for the French throne. He was claiming that he was the rightful heir to the French throne and starting off the 100 Years' War. So again, Edward III now has bigger fish to fry, and so he stops concerning himself with Ireland, thus allowing the Irish to continue doing kind of whatever they want at this point. So he sends his justiciar to Dublin and hoping that could kind of help things out. But he's engaged with war in France and does not really have much to do with Ireland for another couple of decades. And there is also another thing that kind of happens at this time that happens throughout the Middle Ages and the Western Europe that we're talking about that leads people to kind of not worry about politics for too long. And this is the tragedy known as the Black Death Plague that kind of came and swept across Europe and the rest of the world as well. So we're going to talk a little bit about that because that kind of fits right into this time period that we're talking about. And in fact, it is a bit of an invasion itself, so we can bring that into the class topic. But as I said, before Edward could turn his attention back to Ireland or turn his attention back to this 100 Years' War, tragedy struck in the form of this Black Death Plague. And about half the population of Europe and England ended up dying of this outbreak of the Black Death Plague that spread across Europe from Asia in 1347. Now, there were about 3 different strands of the Black Death Plague that hit Europe. The images that I'm showing you here, they're a little bit blown up, but these are manuscript images from this time period. But I do also have a photo up here from, I think, the early 1900s of a victim of the Black Death Plague out of India, I want to say. So it is still a modern plague that is going on. So we know that there were 3 strands of the Black Death Plague that hit Europe, but 2 were quite rare, so I'm not going to really talk about them, but I do have some information about them on this slide here. The most common was the one known as bubonic, which is why it's sometimes known as the bubonic plague as well. Now, this one was spread by rats to humans through infected fleas. So the infected rats would get bitten by their fleas, and then those fleas would bite humans, and they would transfer the disease that way. And so this strain was known as the bubonic because of the telltale buboes that you can see in this image here. These are the buboes, essentially. You can see them all over people and in various areas. And what those are is these buboes would form in the lymph node area closest to where the person was infected through the flea bite. So you see them in the groin, you see them in the neck, armpits, that sort of thing. The bubonic variation generally has an incubation period of about 2 to 7 days before symptoms manifest. And then death can occur within 3 to 6 days after showing symptoms. Between 10 to 40% of victims survive this strain, whereas the pneumonic plague and the septicemic plague are almost 100% death rates. And we don't know a ton about those ones in Europe at this time period. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the arrival of the plague in general. The plague can almost certainly be traced back to Central Asia in the 1330s. It spread out from there, affecting China and India, traveling west into Persia, and then into the Middle East. So it's kind of traveling by trade routes, the Silk Road, if you will. By 1345, it had reached Russia, and through their ports, it traveled to Crimea, where a Genoese shipping fleet brought it overseas into Italy. There was a famous siege, a famous battle site that was happening at Kaffa between Italian merchants and Mongols that was taking place in 1345. And there's this story of, plague bodies being catapulted over the walls of the city. And a lot of people thought that the disease actually started at this siege at Kaffa, but in fact, it didn't really start there. It just happened that that was the most colorful image for the plague entering Europe. But what we do believe is that the Black Death plague spread to the Mongol army that was outside of the besieged city, and that they were, catapulting bodies into the city, and eventually those Italian merchant fleets escaped and brought the disease with them into Europe. So Genoese merchant ships left those Kaffa ports, and they sailed to Constantinople and essentially spread the plague to the enormous city of Constantinople in 1347. And it traveled from there to Italy very quickly. By fall 1348, it had reached London, and it raged there throughout the winter and spring. By May 13, sorry, I'm just trying to figure out if my math here is correct. By May 1349, the plague had reached York and then into Scotland. The port of Howth, which is just north of Dublin, recorded the first case of Black Death plague in Ireland. And from that point, it quickly traveled to Dublin, where it spread inland to the rest of Ireland. This is a pretty good map here. So once it had traveled into Dublin, it was able to sort of spread inland along the road systems and the city systems within the Pale itself, where we do see like more heavier population densities in those areas. Other coastal cities like Waterford, Cork, Kilkenny were soon affected as well. So a lot of these port cities where you have trade coming in and merchants coming in. These cities were more densely populated and were mostly inhabited by Old English and these New English families who tended to congregate in cities because it was safer for protection and also more viable for trade. We have a chronicler out of England known as Geoffrey Le Baker, who wrote that the plague in Ireland, quote, killed the English inhabitants there in great numbers, but the native Irish living in the mountains and uplands were scarcely touched, unquote. And this seems to be pretty common, the fact that the Irish aren't really the ones that are living in these big cities. They're not as affected as the people who are living in those larger cities are. So September through December of 1348, there is a massive pilgrimage movement. A massive pilgrimage movement recorded in Ireland, where thousands of people flocked to a holy monastic site known as St. Molling. And of course, in the days of COVID, we know that a large gathering of people is literally the worst thing that you can do, because all of these people gathered at this Abbey of St. Mulling, and to pray. It was known as a place where you could get cures. And people were together. There was this idea that if you marched around this monastic site in a clockwise formation, praying certain prayers, that a cure could be effected for the people involved. So we have hundreds of thousands of people touching and traveling all these other areas, and becoming infected with the Black Death plague while they're there, and then traveling back home to their more remote rural communities, and then spreading it amongst those families and clan members that they're returning to. And so the interior of Ireland could have almost not been touched by the Black Death plague at all had it not been for this one big pilgrimage movement. At least this is kind of what some historians and archaeologists can kind of point to. We have other evidence from different monasteries that kind of tell us chronicle accounts of the Black Death. A friar at the Franciscan monastery in Kilkenny recorded that 8 monks died in one day, but he says no more about this, presumably because he then also perished. We know that 25 monks died in Drogheda. Another 23 had died in Dublin. We see the Black Death spreading to Limerick by November 1349. A monk there named Fitzralph wrote to the Pope in 1349 saying, quote, "The plague had fallen most heavily on those who live near the sea, and has found more victims among fisher folk and sailors than among other classes of men," unquote. The plague is recorded to be in Ulster by 1340 or 1349, when, quote, "great destruction of people was afflicted therein," unquote. The plague raged in Connaught, and according to the annals there, it was especially bad in County Roscommon, which is this area here. The disease had arrived in Mayo as late as 1350. So we do see the spread of it within Ireland kind of in patchy movements. By December 1349, it appeared for the most part that the plague had finished running its course throughout most of Europe and England. We do still see it popping up in Ireland up until 1350, but for the most part, it was pretty calmed down at this point. After the fact, we see about half of England's population had possibly perished in an 18-month period. In Ireland, our numbers are really less reliable. We do know that in the cities and those more densely populated monasteries, that mortality was far worse. It was far worse than it was in the interior of the island, or those Gaelic populations. But we don't have reliable numbers for Black Death plague deaths in Ireland, unfortunately. But I do want to talk a little bit about what people in Ireland did to kind of fight back against this plague before I kind of turn our lecture over to any questions. Much like in our days of COVID, people in Ireland knew that the plague was arriving, that it would eventually come. And so there were precautions that people took. There were religious processions through city streets. Prayers were said. City gates were closed to travelers. No one was allowed to fly in. The cities, which normally teemed with people and noise, were creepily silent. Church bells were not being rung because normally they were rung for death tolls, and you just couldn't keep ringing the bells constantly. But we do see things where life is still happening. People are still suing other people. Judges are still hearing cases. Church services are still happening if the priest was still alive. Marriages are happening. Baptisms, funerals are happening. We do have records from the Archbishop of Armagh, who shows that he was preaching up until May 1348, but that he's not preaching at all up until March 1349. So he took almost a year off of his preaching, but he was alive after that point and continued preaching. So we don't really know what he did in the interim there. There's a report in 1351 that notes that, quote, "in the time of the said pestilence, the greater part of the citizens of Cork and other faithful men of the king dwelling there all went the way of the flesh," unquote. So there's sort of these dramatic chronicle accounts and kind of cryptic annal accounts that tell us what's happening, but they tell us less about what's happening and more just about the chronicler's inability to give us much detail. The people who were living in the countrysides did try to maintain a bit more of a normality to life. especially those that were um, dealing with kind of pasture animals and their herds. They were able to kind of follow those and stay away from large gatherings of people. The most trying effects of the plague were not really felt until the spring or summer of 1349, where there was substantially less people to work the rented lands of our English lords. We see sheriffs and English officials sort of trying to force peasants to work, but in Ireland that they were less effective there than they were in England or in Europe. In 1352, there is a plea for royal aid from the tenants and farmers of the king's manors in the county of Dublin, essentially echoing a common complaint throughout the eastern areas and the southern areas of Ireland, saying that because of the late pestilence in the lands, as an account of excessive prices of the king's ministers in Ireland, they are so entirely impoverished that unless a remedy be applied, they will not be able to maintain themselves and pay the farm due to the king. So if you don't help us, we can't pay our rents, is essentially what they're complaining, because they don't have enough people to work the land to then pay the rent. The Irish lords and the native Irish definitely took advantage of the chaos that the Black Death plague wrought on our English settlers in Ireland. They were able to make more raids into English held lands. They were able to take back stolen goods and even lands at some times as well. In 1351, on the estates of the Church of Cashel, they say that the lands and rents have all but been totally destroyed by the king's Irish enemies and by the mortality of their tenants in the last plague. So essentially, saying that the Irish are taking back these lands or destroying them, or all of the tenants have died of the plague. So we're just sort of seeing the Irish sort of taking advantage of the fact that this chaos is happening. And overall speaking, the Irish, because they were less affected by the Black Death plague than the English settlers, we do see them able to take back substantially larger amounts of land as time goes on. And a lot of times when we talk about the effects of the Black Death plague on a more global scale, especially when we're looking at Europe, we're looking at the fact that we start to see a shift in the feudal system within Europe. You know, where there are less peasants to till the land and to work the land, and so those peasants are able to demand more freedoms, more rights. They're able to get away with not having to get involved in more of these feudal organizations and being bound to their lands. In Ireland, we don't have as many feudal relationships as we had across Europe and England, so we don't see these peasants uprisings, these revolts of peasants against their lords. We don't see that happening in Ireland quite as much as we do, say, in England, where we had the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. So there aren't these great socioeconomic shifts that happen in Ireland after the Black Death plague, but what we do see are these shifts of land and control from the English held to the Irish held. And part of that is, again, because our English king is far more distracted by A, the Black Death plague, and then B, his war with France as well. So we see less of a concern over this Irish retaking of land than maybe we would have seen under normal circumstances. But eventually, Edward III is able to pay a bit more attention to Ireland. And in 1366, he actually calls together a parliament to meet in Ireland in Kilkenny in 1367. And here, many of the attendees that were invited were of that new English stock, so the newer people that had been moving into Ireland. Many of the old English, those old Anglo-Norman families that had lived in Ireland for centuries, many of them were not invited or were not made to feel as if it would be safe if they had arrived there. And this parliament at Kilkenny is actually a pretty famous one because it issues a number of these statutes. There's about 36 articles that they pass, and there's severe penalties that are imposed on them. And it's less that these statutes had a lot of impact on Ireland, and that's why they're famous, but it reveals to us a lot about what was happening in Ireland at this time, because it must have been happening for the Parliament to be concerned and to be passing laws against them. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of these things that they are passing laws against before we wrap up our discussion of medieval Ireland. So some of the statutes, they begin recognizing that English settlers had been influenced by Irish culture and customs. These statutes were forbidding the intermarriage between the Irish and English, recognizing that that was definitely an issue. They were forbidding the fact that the English could not foster Irish children or vice versa, and that the English were not to adopt Irish children or use Irish names or even dress in an Irish looking fashion. The English colonists who did not know how to speak English were required to learn that language on pain of losing their land and belongings because they were not allowed to speak Gaelic Irish anymore. And they were not allowed to practice other Irish customs. They had to learn the English customs. The English were ordered to stop participating in such Irish pastimes as the sport known as hurling. And instead, they were supposed to work on their own archery skills, which was a far more English practice and sport. And they said that training in the English longbow was a way to not only exercise but to defend against Irish aggression by using English military tactics. So it's kind of interesting the things that they're concerned about, that they're playing Irish sports and stuff. So other statutes that were passed required that the English in Ireland continue to be governed by common law. So obviously there was sort of this slipping back into Brehon law, kind of covering all of Ireland. And that there should be a separation of the Irish and English churches, that no Irishman was supposed to be promoted within the church beyond that of a priest. So we don't even see the Irish being included as bishops or archbishops over their own country. And that becomes kind of a concern later on, especially with the Reformation. These statutes of Kilkenny, although they really have no effect, and the English usually aren't following them, and the Irish certainly aren't abiding by them. What these statutes of Kilkenny just show us is the things that the English were the most concerned about when it came to the Old English in Ireland. That this process of Gaelicization that was occurring was really of a concern, and that the Old English families were becoming more Irish than even the Irish themselves, and this was a reaction against that, an ineffectual reaction, but a reaction nonetheless.